I'd also like to thank the organisers for organising this kind of event and for inviting me to speak. As some of the speakers mentioned, we've just passed the 100th centenary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and as most of you will know, although it's a little bit more complicated, but that agreement laid the foundations for the Kurds, especially, being left without a homeland, a state, a nation state, at the time. And since those 100 years, the Kurds have faced many genocides, many massacres, assimilation in the four parts of what we call Kurdistan, so Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Connecting that to the KurdishQuestion.com, what is the Kurdish question? The Kurdish question is, it's a mistranslation, if you will, of Kürt sorunu from the Turkish, which means the Kurdish problem, or the Kurdish issue. We played on that and we called it the Kurdish question because the Kurds are in a quest to answer the question of what will happen to them, and also the world is after an answer, the international community is after an answer, because Kurdistan is an international colony, of what will happen to the Kurds in terms of their national, ethnic and communal rights. Now, because of the political context that the Kurdish question grew in, there was a massive silence, very deep silence about the Kurdish question in the international arena. If you went onto the internet about 3 years ago and typed in the Kurdish question in Google, you would probably find about 10 pages of information articles in the English language, which would amount to, I don't know, about 200 articles, news pieces, mostly either translations of Turkish texts especially, or international news items, news outlets talking about the Kurdish question, most of them describing the Kurdish movement, or the leading Kurdish movement of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, as a terrorist organization, and the Kurds as separatists. It didn't go beyond this kind of information. If you typed it in Turkish, you would get 99% probably anti-Kurdish sentiment, anti-Kurdish articles about the Kurdish question. Now, if you imagine that most of the people get their information from the internet, especially in the past 10 years, the Kurds, it didn't look very bright for the Kurds in the on the web, as it didn't look very bright for the Kurds in real life. With that in mind, we set up the Kurdish question. There are two founders of the Kurdish question, one of them being me. And our activism for years, especially as English speakers who were brought up in this country, we faced the same problems, and that was of not being understood, not being known. Most people didn't know who the Kurds were, where they were from, that they even existed, but also about what the Kurds wanted. So the Kurdish question was set up to answer some of these questions. We were founded in 2014 on March the 21st, which again you will know is the spring equinox, Newroz, which is the Kurdish New Year, as well as the New Year for other nations in the region. It was on a day where a speech was read at the main Newroz in Diyarbakir, the Kurdish capital in Turkey. It was a speech by the Kurdish leader Öcalan, Abdullah Öcalan, who's been in prison for 17 solitary confinement for 17 years, and it was a message, a declaration of peace. And we set up Kurdish Question essentially to support, to augment, to create an archive, a memory, a narrative, a counter-narrative against the two narratives that existed already from the Kurds, from the perspective of the Kurds. So Kurdish Question has it has an agenda. The agenda of the Kurdish Question on social media is to create content that will tell the story of the Kurds, that will create a narrative for the Kurds, but that will also support the peaceful political solution of the Kurdish Question. Primarily, it was essentially set up for Turkey, But then, with the Syrian conflict and with the rise of ISIS and the resistance against that, it included Syria, or Rojava, as we call it, northern Syria. Kurdish Question has 20,000 followers on Facebook. All of these are what we call organic followers, so none of them were paid for. It has 10,000 followers on Twitter, and the reason for this, I'll give you a few examples, is because the Kurdish Question translates articles, translates documents, translates news items and developments as they happen. So even before the international media can report on something that is happening in Kurdistan, the Kurdish Question already knows about it because the Kurdish Question is on Twitter and following updates in the languages that they're being shared in. So either Turkish, different dialects of Kurdish, Persian, Iranian, or Arabic. One example I can give is of an interview that was conducted with Slavoj Zizek, the well-known philosopher, in Turkish, and we translated this into English, and the title was "The Kurds are the most progressive nation in the Middle East at the moment," and within a few days it had received 60,000 hits. And now for a website which only has 2 people working for it, that's a lot of hits. The importance of it was that we placed the Kurdish question, or even the word Kurdish, into the mouth of somebody who is well known, like Slavoj Zizek, who was saying something positive about the Kurds. A second example is of a young man who was killed by Turkish security forces and then tied to the back of an armored vehicle and dragged along the streets. His name was Hacı Lokman Birlik, and as soon as the images fell on to Twitter, we took the images, and even before the Turkish media, because there was a media blackout, we gave context. We contacted people on the ground in that city, and we got context into what had happened to the young man. So we were a source for news outlets like ITV, like Channel 4, who then reported on the incident. In another world, that might not have happened. In fact, it probably wouldn't have happened, because that information would not have reached the necessary people in the English language. And here language is a big factor, I think, the fact that we're doing it in English. Another is the Jizre massacre, which happened only in this January, where about 178 people were burned alive by Turkish state forces in Jizre, a Kurdish town. Although for days people had been calling for these people to be evacuated, the Turkish state knew about it, ambulances were sent, the local security forces did not allow for the evacuation, the rescue to happen. For days we reported on this without any international media coverage. Again, there was media blackout in Turkish media and the regional media, because they were all portrayed as being terrorists. And again, we managed to, maybe in a limited way, but we managed to break through that silence. We managed to break through the wall of silence, and through our ties with other media outlets like RT, we managed to help them go to the region, or at least to turn their attention to the region. And now it is a case that the UN are involved, and they are calling on Turkey to allow them to go to the region and to investigate. And the final one example is of Amnesty International report on Rojava, on the Syrian Kurds, and ethnic cleansing committed by Syrian Kurdish forces of some Arab villages. After the report came out, we published an open letter, one of our writers published an open letter, and we managed to get testimonies from the local region, and we managed to use other media, Kurdish and progressive media outlets, to create a counter-narrative to what was being said, because we thought it was not fair and it was not true. And statements were made in Kurdish, in Arabic, and we translated these, and finally we managed to get a meeting with Amnesty International, and they retracted some of the claims that they had made in that report, or at least they said that they would go to the region to further investigate these claims. In the end, it turned out that although there was some unjust treatment of people, it wasn't ethnic cleansing, it wasn't a systematic cleansing of any areas. So, I don't know how much time I have left.
There is quite a bit of time.
Okay. Essentially, the KurdishQuestion.com was set up, as I said, to support, to strengthen the understanding of the Kurdish question in English to the international community. We, as activists, didn't have much experience. So I'm an editor of the Kurdish Question, but I have never been an editor or worked as an editor professionally. So we learned as we were doing, as we were becoming involved in the situation. We went with what was happening in the region. And this, I think, is important in relation to social media. If you do not have action on the ground, if you do not go out into the street, if there is no activism, if there is no development of networks between progressive movements, between movements who are fighting, struggling for let's say, minority rights or indigenous rights or women's rights, then social media becomes almost a Kafkaesque labyrinth of a maze of darkness, basically, I think. And you can spend too much time on it without getting any results. But if you do, like the Kurds in this case, have an active fighting force, a struggling force, a movement that is trying to change the balance in the Middle East, then you have a lot of information coming through, you have a lot of sources, you have a lot of developments which you can report on, or you can support with either opinion pieces, essays, videos, photos, documentaries, short films, which we are all trying to incorporate into Kurdish Question. You can create, I think, an alternative, and I think this is very, very important, creating an alternative narrative, or not even alternative, but your own narrative. Because I think for a long time, the story of the Kurds, and I'm guessing the story of a lot of other people, Palestinians, the Baluchis, the Tamils, the Ahwazis, has been told by either the regional despotic powers, the dictators, the states, or by people in the international community or organizations in the international community who do not understand the nuance or the suffering or the trap that has been set for our peoples and our movements. So that is the role of the Kurdish Question. It's to tell the story of the Kurds from a Kurdish perspective, but not exclusively from a Kurdish perspective. We are also, from time to time, when the situation arises, we are self-critical. We are critical of Kurdish movements, Kurdish individuals, Kurdish politicians. But essentially, we are telling our story from how we see it and from how people on the ground see it. In that sense, we have reporters, we have people informing us of what is happening, we have people sending us information, and we have connections within the political, legal, social, economic spheres that are being created by the Kurds to form an alternative system in the Middle East that goes beyond nation states, that goes beyond limited ethnic divides, gender divides, and the Kurdish Question is, with its limited means, is trying to support this. If there is anybody here who is has some money or has some funds or access to funds, the Kurdish Question is essentially looking for funding to expand its team and to become a more professional source of information and an archive that I think will go a long way towards solving the Kurdish Question. Thank you very much.